The funeral was over, but the words still cut. "You're too old to grieve, Mom." Margaret stood alone, surrounded by family, her children already plotting her future without asking what she wanted. The money, the house, the legacy, everything had been reduced to a transaction, but Margaret wasn't finished. Not with grieving. Not with living. And certainly not with being invisible. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. I couldn't breathe as their words sliced through the air. "You're too old to grieve, Mom." The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and dust. Those 2 cents, life cut short and time long past, settled over everything like a veil. Margaret sat on the end of the third pew, hands clasped tight around the white lace handkerchief James had once given her during their first winter together. Her knuckles were pale. Her spine rigid. But the tears had already dried. Grief, she'd learned, didn't need to be loud to be unbearable. The minister droned on about legacy and rest in heaven's gates. She stared straight ahead, past the casket, past the ornate stained glass, into the place where memory curled in on itself. She could still see James rising with the dawn, humming Sinatra as he fixed the leaky faucet, tugging on that awful brown cardigan with the elbows worn out. He'd been warm even when he was difficult. Steady. A man who never said the word love frivolously, but always meant it when he did. The chapel was full. But it might as well have been empty. "Mom shouldn't be sitting up there alone," Sophie whispered behind her. "She insisted," David replied. "She wants to play the grieving widow role, I guess." Sophie gave a soft, humorless laugh. "She's 80. You'd think she'd be used to loss by now." Margaret didn't flinch. Not outwardly. But something fractured just beneath her ribcage. A fissure she hadn't felt in decades, one that reached back through birthdays forgotten, favors expected, silences endured. Her children's words weren't meant for her ears, but they landed all the same. Not with the shock of betrayal. No. It was something colder, confirmation. After the service, they hovered like bees, not around her, but around the executor. Whispers of assets, the house, the investments. Margaret stood quietly near the reception table, paper cup of lukewarm punch in her hand, ignored like the last deviled egg no one wanted to claim. "She can't handle that house alone," Sophie muttered. "She shouldn't," David agreed. "We'll sell it. She can move into one of those communities." Like I was a decision, not a person. Margaret blinked slowly. Numbness was no longer a shield. It was suffocation. A woman in Navy, someone James had worked with, perhaps, offered a gentle hug and murmured, "You were always the strong one." That word again. Strong. The euphemism they used when they needed you silent. She walked outside alone. The air was too warm for March, soft and swollen with the scent of early blooms. A cardinal landed on the hood of her car, bold and bright, and tilted its head as if to say, "Are you still in there?" Inside her chest, something cracked open. They'd said she was too old to grieve, but grief didn't vanish with age. It deepened. It changed shape. It wrapped itself around your bones, familiar and quiet. And it wasn't just about James. It was about all of it, being invisible in the lives she helped build, being dismissed by the children she had raised with careful hands, being filed away like a keepsake no one remembered how to appreciate. She pressed her hand to the cool metal of the car. The last time she'd done something bold, something just for her, she was 35 and dyed her hair red on a James had hated it. Said it made her look loud. She had changed it back within the week. Now, that same boldness flared again, not in her hair, but in her spine. She wouldn't be moved like furniture. She wouldn't be grieved prematurely. She wouldn't be a pawn in a future she hadn't chosen. Margaret smoothed the fabric of her coat, straightened her shoulders, and turned back toward the chapel, not to go inside, but to walk past it, beyond it. Toward something that belonged to her again. With every step across the gravel, she repeated it like a prayer, "I am not done. Not with grieving. Not with living. And certainly not with being seen. The envelope came 3 days after the funeral, delivered with the Morning Post and wedged between a grocery flyer and a coupon catalog. Margaret turned it over twice before opening it, plain cream paper, her name typed neatly on the front in a font that looked like it had never felt emotion. Inside was a summary from the estate attorney. Her share, clearly outlined. Her name, her address, her future. She laid it flat on the table beside her teacup. No fanfare. No ceremony. The numbers stared up at her like judgment. $638,000. It might as well have been a stone. She stared at it for a long while. This was James's life, boiled down. This was what he left behind. After all the dinners, the side jobs, the careful saving, the budgeting notebooks he kept in the desk drawer Margaret still hadn't touched since he passed, it had come to this. A number. A line item. A formality. There should have been comfort in it. Security. Even relief. Instead, Margaret felt something sour crawl up the back of her throat. The next day, Sophie called, not to ask how she was doing, but to coordinate signatures. David and I thought it'd be easiest if we just transfer everything electronically. Quick and painless. Quick and painless. James had been married to her for 57 years. His laughter still echoed off the shower tiles. Hi. Cologne still clung to the collar of his winter coat. And here were her children, acting like grief should follow a timeline. Like money would stitch her back together. Margaret hung up without responding. She wasn't angry, not exactly. But her body pulsed with something colder. A recognition. She'd always known her children were pragmatic. She'd raised them to be responsible. But this was detachment masquerading as maturity. Grief measured in efficiency. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the soft fan spinning shadows overhead like hands waving goodbye. When the sun finally rose, she padded barefoot to James's old desk and opened the bottom drawer. The notebooks were there. Ledger paper, yellowing slightly, still faintly smelling of graphite and aftershave. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through them. Every dollar accounted for. Every bill, every savings deposit, every trip they'd postponed for a better time. Now that time had run out. She found the letter he'd written her years ago, tucked in between 2 utility receipts. A single sheet, his familiar slanted script, asterisk, I want this to make your life easier. Not smaller. Asterisk, her breath caught, because that's exactly what it had become. Smaller. Sharper. Quieter. Her children were dividing the legacy like pie slices, but no one had asked what she wanted. Not once. The money didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a leash. One more way they'd tell her where to live, how to spend, what to let go of. One more room they'd lock her in, lined with velvet and good intentions. She stood, suddenly restless, and moved to the fireplace. Lit a match. She didn't drop the letter. But she hovered, just long enough to feel its weight shift in her hand. Just long enough to imagine the crisp snap of fire licking the edge of a life that wasn't hers anymore. She didn't burn it, not yet. Instead, she folded it back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer. Then she opened a new page in her planner and began writing, not appointments, but questions. Where would I go if no one told me I couldn't? What do I own that I don't want? What is freedom supposed to feel like? Asterisk. Margaret capped her pen, stared out the window at the gray sky, and whispered to the stillness, what if I just gave it all back? She didn't mean the money. She meant the part of herself they'd claimed. And this time, she planned to take it back, on her terms. Asterisk. It wasn't about the money, it was about taking back my dignity. That it began with the smallest thing, a bank statement. Margaret stood in the study, the software of the shredder humming in the corner like a secret kept too long. She fed the statement in slowly, watching the numbers disintegrate into fine ribbons, like snow made of restraint. It didn't scream. It didn't spark. It simply vanished, line by line, until what had once dictated her next move no longer existed. It felt good, better than good. Right, she turned to the next stack. Certificates, titles, account summaries, balance sheets, all drafted neatly by the estate attorney James had trusted. All intended to secure her future. All written in the language of ownership, but none of it hers. She didn't rush. With each slice of the blade, Margaret breathed deeper. Her chest expanded in places that had been collapsed for years, ever since Sophie started calling every Tuesday just to check in and offer gentle instructions on how to live, ever since David began asking if she'd considered a smaller place, somewhere, with a meal plan and medical support built in. It was always said kindly. Casually. Like they weren't dismantling her brick by brick. A printout from their joint investment portfolio went in next. Margaret didn't even glance at the figures. She remembered James poring over it every quarter, brow furrowed, pencil tapping against the edge of his glasses. Always preparing. Always postponing. He meant well. But she hadn't married a man, she'd married a plan. She opened the bottom drawer of the armoire next. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was the locket James had given her on their 25th anniversary. She hadn't worn it in a decade. The clasp caught in her hair, and the photo inside had faded so much that it looked more like a ghost than a memory. She stared at it for a long moment, then gently placed it in a tin with other trinkets, cufflinks, faded greeting cards, a crystal vase they'd received as a wedding gift from someone neither of them remembered. She struck a match. The flame wasn't angry. It was precise. She fed the papers to the fire first, then the cards. Not out of rage, but relief. Each one curled and blackened into ash, leaving behind nothing but heat and silence. A kind of ceremony. A kind of baptism. Upstairs, in the hall closet, she found the boxes marked, for the kids. They'd packed them months ago when James got sick. China sets. Antique linens. A silver tea tray. Margaret ran her fingers across the box top, then opened one and stared at the contents. It smelled like lavender and wood polish. Like resignation, she took out the linen runner and shook it open. It floated like a flag for a country she no longer lived in. The phone rang. She let it go. Outside, wind stirred the bare trees, branches scratching the window like they were trying to remind her of something. You are still here. You have time, Sophie texted 5 minutes later, just confirming. Bank routing is all good. David says we'll sign Monday. You good with that? Margaret read it. Reread it, then she did something she hadn't done in a long, long time. She laughed. That it wasn't cruel. It wasn't bitter. It was startled, like a sound her body had forgotten it could make. She set the phone face down and walked back to the hearth. There was only one drawer left. The thick envelope marked, deed. Her name beside his. One final claim. One final permission slip. Margaret ran her fingers along the edge of the envelope. Her breath was steady. Her hands, still. And with a quiet whisper into the empty room, she said, let's see how it feels to own nothing but myself. Then she turned toward the fire. You burned the documents. David's voice trembled with disbelief. The front door slammed so hard the stained glass in the entryway trembled. Margaret looked up from the hearth, still holding the brass poker, its tip faintly darkened by ash. The fire behind her crackled, a single charred slip of parchment curling in on itself. It had been the deed. David stormed into the room, his coat half on, cheeks flushed, not from the cold, but from fury. Tell me that isn't what I think it is, he said, his voice rising into a sharp edge that didn't suit him. Margaret didn't move. If you think it's the deed, then yes. That's exactly what it is. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd say it out loud. You burned it. You burned the deed. She nodded once, calm as stone. Jesus, Mom, he muttered, dragging a hand through his hair. That's fraud. Do you even know what this means? Sophie and we've already started talking to the attorney about the transfer. You can't just, I can, she said softly, but firmly. And I did. He took a step back, like she'd struck him. Why? What on earth would possess you to? I was tired, Margaret interrupted, of being told how to live. What to keep. What to let go of. That deed wasn't freedom, it was another set of rules dressed up as security. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Outside, a car door slammed, and a moment later Sophie entered the house, her heels clicking like accusations on the tile. I just got off the phone with David, she said breathlessly. Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't destroy. It's true, Margaret said, still facing the fire. I burned the deed. The accounts. Everything. Sophie's face blanched. Do you even understand what you've done? I understand better than anyone, Margaret replied. I've spent my whole life making sure everyone else was comfortable. Your father. You too. I thought this inheritance was going to offer peace. But all it's done is remind me that I was never asked what I wanted. Not once. That money was his legacy, Sophie snapped. You don't get to erase that. Margaret turned to her slowly. Then maybe you should have treated it with the reverence you treat his name. Not as currency. But as memory. David paced the room now, nearly vibrating with frustration. You have no idea what you've done to us. This was supposed to secure things. Keep us afloat. The silence thickened, and then, softly, as if the weight of it was finally too much, David exhaled and sat on the edge of the couch. I'm in trouble, he said. I haven't told Sophie. Or anyone. The business, it's failing. The loan's upside down. The bank's circling. Sophie's head whipped toward him. What? He didn't meet her eyes. I was counting on my portion. To hold everything together. Margaret felt the room spin slightly, like the ground had shifted under them all. Her son, the one who always looked composed in photographs, who delivered polished toasts at every holiday, was unraveling. And she hadn't seen it. You were going to use your father's death to save your business, she said, more to herself than to him. He nodded. I didn't know what else to do. Sophie sat down, stunned to silence. Margaret walked slowly to the window, stared out at the street she'd lived on for 42 years. There were no answers out there. Just bare trees, mailboxes, and the quiet ache of winter settling in. Everything inside her said to protect him, but the woman she was becoming whispered, at what cost? Margaret turned from the window, her voice barely above a breath. If I save you, David, do I lose myself all over again? And in the stillness that followed, no one, not even Margaret, knew what her answer would be. I thought I had won, but now, it feels like I've lost everything. The house was too quiet after they left. Margaret stood in the middle of the living room, the scent of scorched paper still faint in the air, clinging to the drapes like shame. She hadn't lit another fire since. She didn't need to. The burn had already happened, and the echo of it lived in the silence between every tick of the old mantel clock. She moved slowly, collecting the cold teacups they'd abandoned, one still half full, David's lip print visible on the rim. Sophie's was untouched. Margaret poured both into the sink and watched the swirl of gray water disappear down the drain, as if that simple act could carry away the weight of their last conversation. Outside, the sky hung heavy with early dusk. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't cried. Her body felt like a lantern that had run out of oil, hollow, singed at the edges. The next day, no one called, not even Sophie, who usually texted out of obligation. David had gone silent. And though Margaret had braced herself for their fury, for legal threats, for some official-sounding email from a firm she'd never heard of, it was the nothing that hurt most. The vacuum of their withdrawal. She walked her usual loop around the block, wrapped in James's wool coat. She nodded at the neighbors, but didn't stop. Everything in her wanted to shrink back. Inside, to the comfort of the familiar, the safe, but she kept walking. Kept breathing. 1 foot, then the next up by the end of the week, her body felt heavier, but her mind began to settle into the new rhythm. No check-ins. No requests. No gentle suggestions from Sophie about senior fitness classes or David's spreadsheets outlining transition budgets. Just stillness. Just herself. She filled her days with small acts of rebellion. She rearranged the guest room, turning it into a reading nook. She planted the seeds James had bought last fall and never got around to burying. She made blueberry muffins and ate all 6 without freezing a single one. And slowly, a strange thought began to creep in, not as a relief, but as a revelation. She missed them, not their judgment. Not the conversations that always felt like transactions. But the idea of them, the fragments of family she still believed in, deep down. But what if those fragments were illusions? What if her love had become a currency, exchanged and expected, no longer offered freely but as obligation? She sat with that, and still, she didn't reach out. Her body ached in new ways now. The exhaustion wasn't from grief or fury. It was from holding the line. Standing firm when it would have been easier to fold. The deeper truth was simpler, and heavier. She was tired of being misunderstood. Of being the villain in a story she'd spent her life building with nothing but care. One night, as she folded laundry with a sitcom humming in the background, the phone rang. She froze. David's name lit up the screen. Her heart stuttered. Not out of fear, but recognition. That old instinct to make it better, to step back into the role of fixer, peacemaker, provider. Her thumb hovered over the answer button, the room stilling around her like it was holding its breath. She looked at the framed photo beside the television, James. Holding baby David in one arm, his other wrapped around her waist. The photo had always reminded her of what they'd built. But now it asked a new question. Do you still want to carry it alone? The phone rang once more, insistent. Margaret sat perfectly still, staring at the screen. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know if she wanted to pick up, or let it go. Please, Mom, just give me a chance. I'll fix everything. She picked up on the 4th ring. Mom, David said, before she could even speak, thank God. His voice was taut, clipped at the edges with anxiety. She hadn't heard that tremble since he was 13 and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball. He wasn't calling to make peace. He was calling to make a pitch. Margaret sank slowly into the armchair, the one James had always used for reading, and waited. I've been thinking, he rushed on. We don't have to involve attorneys. It doesn't have to be messy. Just give me something. A portion. Enough to restructure. I'll pay it back. She closed her eyes. There it was. Not I miss you. Not I'm sorry. Just a negotiation cloaked in panic. Please, Mom, he said again, softer now. I'll fix everything. I swear. She studied the photo frame still sitting beside the television, the one she'd stared at the night before. The boy in James's arms, all hope and softness, felt miles away from the man on the line now. And yet, some part of her still wanted to rescue him from the storm he'd helped build. I need you to be honest with me, she said, her voice steady but not unkind. Is this about your survival, or your pride? There was a pause. A long one. Both, he finally admitted. I messed up. I know. I took on too much, and I thought, when Dad died, I thought it would just fall into place. Her throat tightened. It was never about the money, she said. It was about being seen. Respected. You didn't even ask what I wanted, David. I'm asking now. No, she replied, firmer. You're asking because you need something. Another silence. Then, the shift. So that's it. You'd rather watch me go under than lift a finger. His tone sharpened, accusation replacing vulnerability. After everything? She felt it like a slap, but didn't flinch. You mean after every birthday you missed? After every time you spoke for me, not with me? After you stood there in that chapel and said I was too old to grieve. That's not fair, he snapped, it's honest. The silence on the line cracked with static. She could hear his breath on the other end, shallow now, agitated. You'll regret this, he said finally, voice low. You will. When the house is gone, when the bank comes for everything, when Sophie and I aren't around to help, don't come crawling back. The old Margaret, the version who would have apologized, who would have scrambled to fix things with muffins and checkbooks, might have begged him not to go, but she wasn't that woman anymore. She stood slowly, walking toward the window, and looked out at the street. The sky had softened into the kind of gray that promised snow by morning. I'll take that risk, she said, calm as snow. The line went dead. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. Instead, she turned off the phone, placed it in the drawer of the hall table, and walked into the kitchen. There were blueberries in the fridge. Flour in the pantry. She'd bake again. Just for herself, and tomorrow, she'd call the community center she'd read about in the newsletter. They needed volunteers, someone to teach basic finance. Maybe someone who knew how to start over. As she slid the muffin tin into the oven, the wind outside howled and rattled the windows. But inside, the air smelled of sugar and defiance. David's words still echoed in her mind, but they no longer owned her. She was free. And she would not regret it. The day after her call with Sophie, Margaret sat in the morning light with plans sprawled across the kitchen table. Not legal ones, those were gone. This was hers, a plane ticket to Maine, a pamphlet for a women's writing retreat, a letter to the community center offering to teach budgeting classes. Each envelope felt alive, each decision hers alone. No signatures needed, she found pleasure in it. For the first time in years, she moved without permission. She canceled the house cleaning service Sophie had arranged. She turned down calls from banks she'd once borrowed from. She unpacked old seashells from the attic, dusted their edges until the ridges gleamed like memories reborn. She didn't call. She didn't send updates. She simply lived. That evening, the phone rang. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. But the tone of what followed was darker than the previous emails. You're selfish, Sophie said, voice cool and insistent. You're rewriting everything Dad worked for. You don't get to erase us because you're hurt. Margaret paused. The accusation carried load, but it no longer felt like weight. You reduced me, she replied softly. I'm reclaiming what wasn't yours to take. What about us? Sophie shot back. What about our future? You'll bankrupt the estate if you don't cooperate. I own myself now, Margaret said. I don't need to explain to protect someone else's fragility. The line dropped. Margaret exhaled, and the world held its breath for a moment. That weekend, she packed a small suitcase and drove north. She stopped at a bookstore in New Hampshire and bought blank journals. In a coastal cafe, she sketched waves in simple watercolor. The moments weren't lavish, just hers. She ate clam chowder at sunrise and watched gulls wheel across the harbor. She inhaled sea air like forgiveness. Back home, she sat with a ledger and sorted the inheritance she hadn't burned. A small savings account for emergencies. Enough she could manage quietly, no heirloom boxes, no annual meetings, no frequent check-ins. Money became neither shackle nor trophy. It became a lifeline. She wrote in her journal by candlelight, this inheritance is mine because I chose it. Not because I forgive, but because I remember what freedom tastes like. Days later, she called the community center. They welcomed her. She started teaching finance lessons to women rebuilding after separation or loss. She laughed with a group over spreadsheet mistakes. She shared the locket story, how memory fades, but dignity shouldn't. The women listened. They leaned in. And one by one, they found their way back to themselves. Margaret stopped watching the phone. She stopped waiting. She wore the cardigan James hated, shocking red, because she could. She arranged for a small exhibit of paintings at the local library. She traveled not to prove she existed, but because she did. Her phone buzzed again one spring morning. It was Sophie, are you there, Margaret stared at the message. No pressure. No anger. Just that, almost hesitant. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked to her garden. The tulips James planted last fall had bloomed early. Their petals reached toward the sky. She breathed in deeply, the smell of earth and rain. She pressed her thumb to one delicate petal and whispered, maybe. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and looked up at the sky above the tulips, sunlight soft on her face. She tapped the message, maybe, and then, sent, Margaret stood at the edge of her own living room, the soft afternoon light catching dust motes. Sophie and David sat opposite her at the coffee table, Sophie's expression guarded, arms fall. Dead, David's jaw clenched, like someone bracing for a verdict. The air tasted metallic, charged with the culmination of weeks she never wanted, and moments she couldn't avoid. David cleared his throat. Mom. I should have told you from the start. His voice wavered. My business problems, yes, they were bad, but not because demand dropped or the bank was unfair. Because I bet poorly. I gambled, Mom. I lost. I lied. Silence bloomed afterward. Margaret's heart thudded, not in triumph or shock, but in recognition. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. Everything changed the day I realized hiding the truth was easier than facing disappointment. Your losses, David, they're your own. He flinched. You don't understand. I do, she interrupted. Because I let your control grow under the guise of love. Because I bent until I broke. Sophie's arms fell away, and her face softened. She looked at Margaret with a new kind of concern. I thought I was helping. But I just silenced you more. Margaret inhaled. That inheritance, I burned it not to hurt you, but to refuse being erased again. To reclaim my life. David shook his head, resolve flickering. So you walked away. Now I'm losing everything. And now this is all on you. Margaret let a breath out slowly. I didn't walk away from you. I walked toward myself. And you chose your path when you refused help. Sophie leaned forward. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't see it until now. David's face darkened with anger. Sophie, you shouldn't comfort her. This is about me drowning. Her eyes shifted between them. You were drowning in secrets. I won't drown because I demanded honesty. Sophie glanced down, tears pricking. I'd give up my inheritance in a heartbeat, just to have you back. Margaret felt a warm shock ripple through her. But David pivoted, frustration boiling over. She just doesn't get it, Mom. You ruined us. Margaret stood slowly. The floor creaked beneath her. You ruined yourself, David. And I won't be collateral for that. A long silence settled, thick as winter. Dusk. Sophie looked torn between tears and defiance. David looked defeated, small and raw. Margaret sank into the armchair James once used. I have no more words, she said. No more permission slips. No more guilt. She looked at Sophie, her voice quieter. I love you both. But I love myself more. Sophie nodded, mouth trembling. I understand. David reddened. The anger there pulsed, but for the first time, it was untethered. Then something shifted. Sophie rose and offered a seat beside Margaret. Let me stay. Margaret met her gaze. No forgiveness forced, just offered space to rebuild. David stood rigid. His breath jagged. I'm done. With that, he turned and left, door shutting behind him with a final click. Sophie remained, small and vulnerable beside Margaret, Margaret wrapped an arm around her shoulder. They stayed in silence until the light softened, and the room felt both empty and full. As the front door locked shut behind David, Margaret stared at the floor where his shoes stood before. And suddenly, the question came rushing into her: if I save him now, will I be doing this all over again? Sometimes, freedom comes at the highest price. Loneliness. The silence after David left wasn't like the others. It didn't crackle with tension or carry the weight of unsaid words. It just settled. Heavy. Permanent. Margaret sat in the armchair long after Sophie had gone, the last of the day's light skimming the tops of the curtains. She stared at the spot where David had stood, his body rigid, his voice raw, and felt an ache that no amount of resolve could fully quiet. She'd drawn a line. And now that it was real, drawn in ash and silence, it hummed beneath her skin like a burn still healing. And the days that followed, the house echoed differently. The kettle seemed louder in the morning. Her footsteps down the hallway longer. She caught herself reaching or her phone to send David an article, to ask Sophie about her latest conference, then paused, remembering, they weren't gone, exactly. But something between them was. At the community center, Margaret remained a quiet presence. She led her finance group with warmth, even cracked a few jokes during a session on retirement scams. But when the women spoke of family, estranged children, regretful spouses, Margaret didn't offer her own story. She simply listened, nodding at the right moments, her own grief folded into the corners of her notebooks. It wasn't regret. Not exactly. She didn't wish she'd done it differently. But there were moments, quiet ones, where she felt the ache of what she'd lost. Sunday mornings were the hardest. James used to bring in the paper and make terrible toast, blackened on one side, slathered in too much jam. David would stumble down late, hair wild, grumbling about homework. Sophie would flip through the style section, circling things she'd never buy. The house used to hum with imperfect joy. Now, it was just the click of the radiator and the rustle of leaves outside. Margaret sat by the window with a mug of tea and thought about what freedom really meant. It wasn't dinners alone, though she cooked for herself now with intention, creamy soups, crusty bread, even dessert. It wasn't the solitude, though she'd grown to appreciate how her thoughts stretched without interruption. It was something subtler, not having to explain. Not having to soften her words for someone else's comfort. Not living by a script written for her by people who believed they knew best. She had earned this. Even if it came with silence. One afternoon, while sorting mail, a cream-colored envelope caught her eye. No return address. Just her name, scrawled in familiar handwriting. Sophie's. Inside was a simple invitation card: Harrison Family Reunion, June 10th, Lakefield Park, we'd like you there. She stared at it. There was no plea. No apology. Just an open door. Margaret set the card down on the table. The afternoon sun shift ed across the hardwood floor, catching the gold edges of the invite. She didn't move. She thought about the woman she'd been at the funeral, quiet, invisible, trying to grieve and being told she was too old to feel, and the woman she was now, bold enough to say no. Brave enough to burn paper that claimed her future. Was she ready to walk back into that circle? Did she want to? She ran her fingers over the card once more, her breath catching. The wind outside picked up, brushing the curtains like a whisper. Are you ready to be seen again? Margaret looked toward the horizon. She didn't answer. Not yet. The past was gone. I had no choice but to move on. Margaret stood at the back of the gathering, watching a handful of children chase each other around the edge of the picnic area. The trees above cast a patchwork of sun and shadow across the worn grass, and somewhere a Bluetooth speaker played Motown too quietly to cut through the wind. A folding table sagged beneath a spread of potato salad, buns, and warm soda. Paper name tags fluttered on lapels, as if unsure they belonged. She hadn't worn one. Instead, she held a paper plate of fruit she wasn't eating and watched. David stood under the pavilion, talking to someone she didn't recognize. His shirt was too crisp, his smile too polished. But every so often, he looked toward her. Quick glances. Measured. She didn't look away, Sophie approached halfway through the hour, holding 2 lemonade cups. It's warm today, she offered, her voice even. Margaret nodded and took the drink. They stood like that, side by side, not touching, watching an uncle argue with a toddler about sunscreen. Thanks for coming, Sophie said. I wasn't sure if you would. I wasn't sure either. Silence stretched between them, but it didn't buckle under its own weight this time. David, Sophie started, then stopped. He's trying. Margaret sipped the lemonade. Too sweet. I'm not here for him, she said finally. I'm here because I wanted to see if I still fit into the shape you all remember. Sophie's brow creased. And? I don't. For a moment, neither moved. Then Sophie exhaled. Maybe none of us do anymore. Margaret looked over the park again, at the second cousins whose names she couldn't recall, the way the picnic table sagged under expectation. Do you want to sit? Sophie asked, motioning toward a bench. No, Margaret smiled faintly. I think I've been sitting for too long. David made his way over near the end, his posture looser now, but his eyes still wary. He didn't apologize. Not directly. He asked if she needed help carrying anything. If she'd parked far. Small gestures, they didn't stitch the wound shut, but they kept it from reopening. When she left, no one begged her to stay. No one asked for more than she was willing to give. Back home, Margaret slipped out of her shoes by the front door and walked barefoot through the quiet house. It didn't echo the same way anymore. It felt like it belonged to her, not to the ghost of some former version. She set the leftover fruit in the fridge, washed the cup, dried her hands on the towel James used to hate for being too floral. When she checked the mail, an envelope with the community center's logo sat on top. Inside was a letter. Dear Margaret, we're launching a new program for women over 60 who want to restart. Not just finances, but life. We're creating something big. And we want you to lead it. She reread the line twice. Lead it, not assist. Not advise. Led. She walked to the kitchen window and stared out at her garden, now in full bloom. Daffodil. Ls. Tulips. Tiny green shoots that had no name but reached anyway. Margaret set the letter on the counter, heart thrumming with something that felt suspiciously like joy. The doorbell rang just then. She turned, startled, wondering, was it a delivery, or something else stepping into her life, waiting to begin? With every step I took away from them, I walked closer to myself. The doorbell hadn't rung in hours. Margaret stood in the hallway, a half-folded laundry basket in one arm, the letter from the community center still warm from where she'd carried it around the house. She opened the door cautiously, no expectations, just muscle memory, and found a young woman standing there with a tote bag slung over her shoulder and a clipboard in hand. Miss Harrison? She asked, cheerful but nervous. I'm Hannah, from the community center. Denise said you might need help getting started. Margaret blinked. Started? The leadership project. They said you'd agreed to run it. Margaret hadn't agreed yet, but something in Hannah's face, eager, hopeful, still a little uncertain, made her nod. Yes, she said, I suppose I have. It began like that, quietly. By the end of the month, Margaret was back in the center's old sunroom with a folding chair beneath her and a circle of women, widows, retirees, divorcees, survivors, gathered around her like seedlings in loose soil. She didn't speak first. She let the silence bloom, the kind of hush that invited truth instead of fear. When she finally shared her story, not all of it, but enough, the room held its breath. And then it exhaled with her. They called it Second Season, a program built for women who'd given everything and now found themselves wondering if there was more. Margaret helped them learn to budget, yes, but she also helped them grieve. To breathe again. To be again. Outside of the center, she traveled. Maine again. Then Santa Fe. Then a weekend in a cabin on Lake Superior with nothing but books and her own company. She wrote postcards to no one and kept them in a box by the fireplace. One simply read, I found joy without asking for permission. David didn't call often. But when he did, it was softer. Not filled with demands, just updates. Tentative ones. He asked about the center once. Just once. Margaret told him it was good. That was enough. Sophie sent a birthday card in April. Inside, she'd scribbled, "I'm still learning how to show up. Thank you for showing me how." Margaret placed it next to the photo of her garden, sunlight spilling across the tulips. They were starting to open again. Life didn't explode into joy. It unfolded. Slowly. Like honey poured from a jar, thick, warm, unhurried. Margaret repainted the guest room in sunflower yellow. She bought a second-hand record player and played jazz while she made breakfast. She stopped measuring time by obligation and started counting it in moments that mattered: conversations with strangers, cool breezes through open windows, the feeling of standing barefoot in freshly watered soil. Then, one afternoon, as she was finishing a workshop session, Denise pulled her aside. "There's a foundation upstate," she said, eyes wide. "They heard about second season. They want to meet you. They think this could be national." Margaret paused, hands still resting on the back of her chair. "National?" Denise nodded, beaming. "They want to sponsor expansion. New cities. New voices. They want you to lead it." She didn't speak. She looked at the women gathering their coats behind her. She thought about James's quiet routines. David's anger. Sophie's lemonade, and then she looked at the woman in the reflection of the window, upright, silver-haired, eyes fierce with clarity. This wasn't about recognition. That it was about roots, and how deep they'd grown. Margaret turned toward Denise, heart pounding, not with fear, but with purpose. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said, a smile curling at the edge of her mouth. And as she stepped back into the sunlight, the idea of next no longer frightened her. It thrilled her. "The greatest legacy I can leave is peace, not control." The soft knock on the classroom door came just after Margaret erased the whiteboard. A woman from admin peeked in with a clipboard and a smile. "They've confirmed," she said. "The foundation board approved your leadership grant. And there's something else. A gala. They want you to speak." Margaret didn't answer right away. She placed the marker back in its tray, wiped her hands on her skirt, and exhaled slowly. There had been a time, years ago, when such news would have spun her into a frenzy. Outfit planning, speech rehearsing, double-checking RSVPs. But not now. Now, everything in her life had slowed to the pace of truth. She nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Outside, the afternoon sun spilled like molasses across the sidewalk. Margaret walked home through the neighborhood slowly, nodding to familiar faces: Mrs. Chen watering her geraniums, a teenager tossing a frisbee to a golden retriever. The world had continued, just as she had. No longer as someone's mother, someone's wife. Just Margaret at home. She set her keys on the side table and noticed the note Sophie had left earlier in the week, taped gently to a tin of shortbread. "Thought you might like these. And thank you for giving me time to grow, too." Margaret had smiled then. She smiled again now. The distance with Sophie and David hadn't vanished. It had simply reshaped itself. Where there was once daily tension, there were now quiet understandings: an email here, a postcard there. They hadn't become what they used to be. But they were Psalm. Effing. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret had no desire to mold it into anything more. She no longer chased closeness. She allowed space. She tended her peace like a garden, slowly, without urgency. At the center, the second season program was thriving. Margaret gave lectures on financial freedom, hosted tea circles, and introduced weekly reflection prompts. One woman brought in a handmade quilt, another brought a homemade pie. They weren't there to impress each other. They came because they wanted to sit with someone who knew what it was to start again after loss, not in spite of age, but because of it. Margaret had stopped measuring success in applause or approval. She measured it in the way her shoulders relaxed after a session. In the way someone laughed for the first time in months. In the soft thank you whispered after class, more heartfelt than any grand speech, she had stopped needing to steer every ship. She could let others drive, and not feel small for it. One Sunday, as she clipped lavender from her garden, David called. She didn't rush to answer. When she did, his voice was quieter, gentler. He mentioned a new job. A smaller place. Fewer risks. I thought I needed to win, he said. Turns out, I just needed to stop gambling with people's trust. There was a pause. No pressure to fill it. I'm glad you're doing well, Mom. She smiled, the lavender scent soft between her fingers. So am I. That night, she lit a single candle and played a Miles Davis record. She sat with a mug of chamomile and wrote in her journal, not to make sense of the past, but to remember how far she'd come without controlling the outcome. The next morning, her phone buzzed again, an email, subject line, keynote invitation, Women Leading Change Gala. Margaret blinked. They wanted her to speak. Not as a widow. Not as a cautionary tale. But as a leader. Margaret tapped the message open, then glanced at her reflection in the glass of the kitchen window. She didn't see Sumio. Later, as she sat on the back patio of the center with a cup of coffee warming her palms, she watched the crowd thin. Sophie was helping fold chairs. David was collecting scraps of paper near the dessert table. Neither of them hovered. Neither of them retreated, they just helped. Denise joined her briefly. They're not who I expected, she said softly. No, Margaret replied. Neither am I. A breeze rustled the edges of the event program beside her. On the back cover, printed in elegant script, was her name. Not as a donor. Not as a guest as a founder. Margaret watched as one of the women from her class approached David with a question about budgeting. To her surprise, he listened. He pointed at the pamphlet. He didn't deflect. She hadn't asked them to believe in her vision. But maybe, slowly, they had begun to see it. When the last string light was unplugged and the final chair folded, Sophie handed her a tote bag full of thank you notes written by members of the program. Margaret held it to her chest. You did this, Sophie said, eyes bright. And it matters. They stood together, quiet, beneath the wide sky. A crescent moon hung like a blessing above them. As Margaret rode home in the passenger seat of her own car, Sophie now at the wheel, she glanced out the window at the darkened town. Lights flickered in homes she would never enter, lives she'd never touch. But in that moment, she realized, her legacy wasn't money, or memory. It was motion. And it was still moving. I'm walking into the future I've always dreamed of, one where I'm truly free. The air in Rome smelled like citrus and brick dust, sun-warmed and ancient. Margaret stepped through the arched stone gate of the Trastevere courtyard, a canvas bag on her shoulder and a guidebook she barely used clutched in one hand. She was alone, and she was exactly where she wanted to be. She'd booked the tea. Rip 6 weeks ago. No fanfare, no travel companions, no itinerary beyond her instincts. She visited museums slowly, lingered in cafes with thick coffee and thin biscuits, scribbled lines of poetry in a worn journal between mouthfuls of pasta. Every night, she sat on her balcony overlooking a crooked alley lit by string lights. She listened to the murmur of strangers below and let the night carry her forward, not with urgency, but with ease. Back home, the center continued to hum without her. Denise kept things running. The women still met every Tuesday. Margaret had prepared them for this. Not her absence, her evolution, and Sophie had sent her a message the night before she boarded her flight. I'm proud of you, Mom. Even when I don't say it right. David helped organize a fundraiser last week. I think it finally clicked for him, what you were building. What it cost you. Come back whenever you're ready. We're here. Margaret had read it twice. Smiled. Then set the phone down and poured herself a glass of wine. Now, in the early evening light, she sat on the church steps, sketching. A woman passed with a child on her hip and smiled. Margaret smiled back. No recognition. No expectations. Just presence. Later, at her rental apartment, she flipped open her laptop to check emails. Buried beneath newsletters and updates was one marked urgent in bold. From a name she didn't know. She clicked. The message was brief. Ms. Harrison, we've followed your work with second season and the growth of your community impact model. We believe your initiative has global potential and would like to invite you to lead a pilot project in 3 international partner cities. Fully funded. Your voice has power. We'd like to help amplify it. Let us know if you're open to a conversation. The Ascend Foundation. Margaret leaned back, the screen's glow painting her face silver in the dusk. She exhaled slowly. That it wasn't just the size of the offer. It was what it meant. Her story, once buried under loss and silence, had become something others wanted to carry forward. She stood and opened the window. The sounds of laughter and dishes clinking floated up from the alley below. She let them in. Her legacy had once been imagined in porcelain teacups and tidy ledgers. Now, it was carried in the backs of notebooks, in volunteer hours logged by women finding their voices, in whispered encouragements around folding tables. She'd never asked to be seen this way, but now, she wouldn't hide from it. Margaret closed the laptop, heart steady but alive with electricity. The church bells rang below, long and low. She stepped out onto the balcony and whispered to the night, let's see how far this can go. This is the life I fought for, and it's mine to embrace. The wind at the edge of the ocean in Lisbon tasted of salt and possibility. Margaret stood on a bluff above the water, arms folded gently over her chest, watching the waves eat and return the shoreline like a language only the sea understood. A camera hung around her neck. Not because she needed to remember this moment, but because it reminded her she was part of something bigger now, something she had chosen. She had accepted the Ascend Foundation's offer 3 months ago. Since then, second season had expanded into 2 new countries, with pilot programs taking root in Mexico City and Budapest. Margaret's name was being spoken in rooms she would never enter, printed in brochures she hadn't designed. It wasn't ego. It was continuity. Back in the States, Denise now led the home chapter. Sophie helped coordinate quarterly retreats. And David, in a surprise no one had anticipated, least of all herself, now handled budgeting for one of the newer branches. That it wasn't closeness. Not in the way Margaret once believed families were supposed to operate. But it was honest. It was earned. From time to time, they sent her photos. Sophie standing beside a table stacked with books, captioned, Mentorship Day. David outside a modest brick building with a new sign, second season, East Side office. She smiled each time she saw them. Proud, but not dependent. Grateful, but not tethered. The real shift had happened not in her charity, not even in her family, but in the still, early mornings when she wrote in her notebook. She had stopped asking what they thought. She had stopped waiting for permission. She had started speaking in full sentences, on the page and off, and her voice was clear. Now, she stepped back from the edge of the bluff and walked the cobbled path toward the local market, where she'd agreed to meet a new contact from a women's cooperative. They were looking to launch something similar to second season, and someone had whispered her name. That afternoon, she helped paint signs for a community education campaign, her hands streaked with blue and ochre, her laughter mixing with women decades younger and older than she was. They didn't ask her for her resume, they just listened when she spoke, and later, when one of the youngest women asked her how she'd come to lead such a life, Margaret paused before answering. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked up at the soft pink clouds gathering over the rooftops. I stopped trying to be needed, she said. And started wanting to matter. That night, back in her tiny apartment above a bakery, she lit a candle and turned on a voice memo recorder. It was something new she was trying, collecting oral histories for a future archive. Hers would be the first. My name is Margaret Harrison, she began, voice calm and sure. I was once a mother, a wife, a woman. People expected to make room for everyone but herself. I don't live that way anymore. I've learned that kindness doesn't mean silence. That compassion includes yourself. And that legacy, she smiled, As Margaret curled beneath a blanket with a book in her lap and the recorder still warm beside her, she looked out the window at the golden streetlights. Her eyes reflected back something rare, not ambition or restlessness, but peace. The fight was over. She had already won.